Apparently, I'm one song short. Although I did like that solo, that's good. All right, I'm all ready to come up here. It's the moment, and the moment they finished, I realized that I did not have my mic on, so sorry about that. Open your Bibles to 1 Kings chapter 17. If you're watching online, thanks for being patient and bearing with us. You're going to be rewarded because these are two great chapters. In fact, after all the killing and slaying that we've been seeing for months now, as we go through the Old Testament and through 1 Kings, tonight, I don't think one person dies in chapter 17. Now, hundreds are going to be slaughtered in chapter 18, but at least chapter 17 has no fatalities that I can remember. So I guess that's a good thing. Both chapters are fantastic in that we move on from the life of the kings to the life of one of God's prophets, and that is the prophet Elijah, which has a fascinating life and an interesting ministry. And as soon as we're done with Elijah, he transfers his ministry to Elisha, and we'll look at that next time. All right. 1 Kings chapter 17, verse 1. Now Elijah the Tishbite from Tishbe in Gilead said to Ahab, "As the Lord, the God of Israel lives, whom I serve, there will be neither dew nor rain in the next few years except at my word." Now, let me stop there just for a second. This is Elijah the prophet. For us, we know him as a famous prophet. I told you, the only prophet and the only person to go into heaven without dying on a chariot of fire. And so that's Elijah. That's how his life is going to end. If you get to go into heaven on a chariot of fire, you're having a good day. And that's what's going to happen. We're not going to get to that tonight, but it is a great event. So that's who this is, and he's talking to Ahab. Now, Ahab is the king. Ahab is an evil king, and he's married to a really evil wife. Her name was Jezebel. Ahab and Jezebel, two of the most wicked people in history, in fact. Jezebel, his wife, was systematically trying to kill all the prophets in Israel and replace those with her prophets of Baal. And so we're going to see that where that ends up tonight as a result of that. So that this conversation is between Elijah and Ahab, the evil, wicked king. Elijah says to King Ahab, there's going to be a famine in the land, severe, neither dew nor rain in the next few years. And I like the last clause, except at my word. That is, when the drought comes, if you get tired of everything dying, if you get tired of not having any water, if you get tired of everybody being hungry, I'm the key. You better find me, because I alone, God's given me the discretion to decide when this drought ends. I don't know of another time in the Bible where God does this, that he leaves it up to one of his prophets to choose and decide. Now, we're going to see later on that at the conclusion of the drought, God actually led Elijah to end the drought. So he's still listening to God, even though he says, until I say, nothing's going to happen. Verse 2, then the word of the Lord came to Elijah. Leave here, turn eastward, and hide in the Kerith ravine, east of the Jordan. You will drink from the brook, and I have ordered the ravens to feed you there. So God comes to Elijah and says, okay, I've got a plan. He says, I want you to go live in this ravine, and I will send some food. Well, what do you do when God tells you to do that? You do what he tells you. It doesn't give me any backstory. It doesn't tell us what Elijah is thinking. But this is not luxury living. It's not a 5-star hotel. He's living in a ravine down by the river. And so he's dependent upon God. Literally, there's a river there, a brook. He's got to drink water from the river, and he waits for the birds to show up to bring him something to eat, which is an interesting plan. We don't even know how long this happened. It may have gone on for months or even a year or so. Long time. And so God says that. By the way, can anybody tell me why would God give him that directive? Why have him live in a ravine? Yeah, who's he hiding from? He's hiding from Ahab, because Ahab is a wicked guy. His wife, he's really hiding from Jezebel more than anybody, because Jezebel would certainly want to kill him as well. God knows that there's a mark on him now, a target on him, and God says, of all the ways that God could have done this, God says, I want you to go live in this ravine. Of course, God could have killed Ahab and Jezebel in the next heartbeat. God can do that. He's sovereign. And sometimes we wonder, sometimes I wonder, God, why do you let this evil person over here, over there, this wicked ruler, why do you let them continue to live? God does what he does in his sovereignty and his understanding. Our job is not to question God as to why he does what he does. Our job is to trust God. And so Elijah trusted him. Verse 5. So he did what the Lord told him. He went to the Kerith ravine east of the Jordan and stayed there. The ravens brought him bread and meat in the morning and bread and meat in the evening, and he drank from the brook. So he had good protein. Now, again, all kinds of Western mindset questions come to my mind. Where did he get the bread? Was it white or wheat or sourdough? What was the meat that they brought him? They didn't specify what kind of meat. Was it cooked or uncooked? And we don't know. It's not really the point of the passage. The truth is God provided for him in a supernatural way, which, by the way, God has the authority not over only all mankind. He has authority over the animals. And he could cause any animal to, he calls a donkey to talk in the Old Testament. God can lead and guide in his sovereignty, not only humankind, but the animal kingdom as well. And so I don't know if the ravens had any idea what they were doing, but they were instructed by God to do this, and so they did it. Verse 7, sometime later the brook dried up because there had been no rain in the land. Then the word of the Lord came to him. Go at once to Zarephath of Sidon and stay there. I've commanded a widow in that place to supply you with food. So he went to Zarephath. When he came to the town gate, a widow was there gathering sticks. He called to her and asked, would you bring me a little water in a jar so I may have a drink? As she was going to get it, he called, and bring me, please, a piece of bread. So God directed Elijah to Zarephath, which is a town in the Mediterranean, on the Mediterranean coast between Tyre and Sidon in Phoenicia, which is the homeland of the evil queen Jezebel. And so this was in the heart of pagan territory, in the territory of Baal. And so God sends him right there into the thick of things. So he ends up going from somewhere that's remote and hidden to a place like this, not even a Jewish place. Zarephath was 80 to 90 miles from Kerith, and God told Elijah that a widow would feed him. Widows were usually poor people. Normally they ran out of food first in a famine because there was nobody to provide for them. This famine had been created by the drought, and the drought was created by God and controlled, or the end was controlled by Elijah. And the irony of it, here comes Elijah, the very one that God had spoke through about the drought, and he's wanting provision from this widow. And so it goes to the widow, and again, it's a strange directive. You know the story as well as I do, that she doesn't have much left. For him to ask her for a drink would normally not been terribly unusual, except for he was a Hebrew and she was not. But they're in a drought. To ask somebody for a drink of water in a drought in that day was pretty audacious. But he goes even further. As casually as can be, he says, "Oh, on your way, would you give me some bread? Bring me some bread too." So verse 12. "As surely as the Lord your God lives," she replied, "I don't have any bread, only a handful of flour in a jar and a little oil in a jug. I'm gathering a few sticks to take home and make a meal for myself and my son, that we may eat and die." She does not necessarily recognize who he is, but she does recognize that he is a Hebrew. And she says, "As surely as your Lord lives." Now that's just a colloquialism for you and me, but for her it's quite a statement because she is not a Hebrew. And yet she is acknowledging the existence of Elijah's God. So the first statement she makes, as a non-Hebrew, first statement she makes is her acknowledgement of his God, which is impressive. She says, "I don't have any bread. I've got just a little bit of flour and oil, so I can make bread, just a tiny little amount for me and my son. This is our last meal." In droughts, at that time, 3,000 years ago, when there was a bad drought, people died. Tons of people, entire cities, entire nations would suffer. Millions could die in a drought. Now, today we have wells and we have imports and that sort of thing that help a great deal, but back then there was no government assistance, there were no programs, there was no imports. They just died. And so she said, "This is the end for us. That's the plan. We're going to have one final meal and die." Verse 13, Elijah said to her, "Don't be afraid. Go home and do as you have said. But first, make a small cake of bread for me from what you have and bring it to me, and then make something for yourself and your son. For this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. The jar of flour will not be used up, and the jug of oil will not run dry until the day the Lord gives rain on the land." Now this is a moment. It's an opportunity for the woman, but it takes a step of faith. And I mean faith, because obviously if she only has enough for a little cake for herself or one hot roll for her son, and she gives part of it to the prophet, then she doesn't have enough left for her and her son. So this really takes a step of faith on her part. But she does it. Verse 15, he makes that promise to her. She went away and did as Elijah had told her. So there was food every day for Elijah and for the woman and her family. For the jar of flour was not used up, and the jug of oil did not run dry, in keeping with the word the Lord had spoken by Elijah. So she recognized that he was an Israelite. She trusted him when he said that God has made this promise that he's going to provide for her, and there will always be enough flour and enough oil for bread. So she stepped out in faith. She was afraid, it does say, and he calmed her fears, and then he gave her the promise. Verse 17, sometime later, the son of the woman who owned the house became ill. Now let me stop right there. This is a second half to the story, and it's an interesting part of the story. As we go there, it's important to note, like this woman, you don't have to be a theologian to trust God. You don't have to be a seminary graduate or a pastor or a deacon or a Sunday school teacher to trust God. You don't have to be very bright at all to trust God. But it's not instinctive. This woman had no faith virus that gave her the ability, and sometimes I think we have that notion that faith is like a virus, a cold, and you just don't have that gene. You just don't have that virus, and I just don't have any faith. You can choose to have faith. Whether you're a theologian or just an average person, whether you know a lot about the Bible, a little bit, or nothing at all. How much Hebrew do you think she knew? How much of the Old Testament? How much of the Ten Commandments? How much of the knowledge of Scripture, of what happened to Joseph and his sons, and what happened through Moses and all of the miracles that God did? She probably didn't know of any of it, but she had faith. And so God took care of her. So sometime later, we don't know how long later, a week, month, year, we don't know, the son of the woman who owned the house became ill. He grew worse and worse and finally stopped breathing. Which means what? Yeah, if you stop breathing, you're dead. She said to Elijah, what do you have against me, man of God? Did you come to remind me of my sin and kill my son? So it's interesting. She thinks that, first of all, it's a judgment against her for her sin. But she is perplexed and confused, and it's understandable. Because what is the point of a great miracle? And by the way, this was not a great miracle. This was many great miracles because it was a miracle that happened every single day. How about that? Maybe the most miracles in the Bible are right here because every day was a new miracle that God provided a little more flour and a little more oil. And she couldn't do the math in her mind. And again, it's understandable. We tend to be this way. Why would God do this? Why would you provide this only to have my son die anyway? And so she proposes, or she confronts him with that. Verse 19, give me your son, Elijah replied. He took him from her arms, carried him to the upper room where he was staying, and laid him on his bed. Then he cried out to the Lord, O Lord my God, have you brought tragedy also upon this widow I am staying with, by causing her son to die? Then he stretched himself out on the boy 3 times and cried to the Lord, O Lord my God, let this boy's life return to him. The Lord heard Elijah's cry, and the boy's life returned to him, and he lived. Elijah picked up the child and carried him down from the room into the house. He gave him to his mother and said, look, your son is alive. Now, just 2 things you want to note from that. Again, what a fantastic miracle. The woman believed, but her faith in God is about to get a giant boost. In verse 24, the next verse, it says, Then the woman said to Elijah, Now I know that you're a man of God and that the word of the Lord from your mouth is the truth. Here's what I've learned from what little experience I've had in 30 years of ministry and 58 years of life. Even though we come to moments of great faith, God will bring us to that. And we take that step of faith, like Peter stepped out of the boat, and we feel strong spiritually. We feel close to God relationally. And it's a mountaintop moment for us. It is extraordinary how when the days, weeks, months, and years go by, our faith begins to dissipate. It begins to struggle. It's like we have difficult time remembering. We have short memories. Again, as I've related this to you before, it's kind of like husbands and wives when you say, I love you. And you can't go 3 or 4 or 5 years between I love yous. Even though you've settled it, even if you've convinced your spouse 100% that you love them, you still need to say it from time to time. You still need to reconnect in that statement and that sincere belief from time to time. It's just the way that we are. And so God used this terrible tragedy to connect her, not only to reconnect her to the place that she was in her faith, but to bring her to a new level of faith. Because certainly the woman already believed that he was a prophet from God because a miracle was happening every day in her house. We already know that she was a person of faith because she made him that bread first. But now it's at a new level. I also wonder if this was not necessary to strengthen the faith of even Elijah. Elijah was a man, he wasn't perfect. And even men, even spiritual leaders struggle with faith sometimes, and God wanted to strengthen him as well. The second thing I want you to note is this, and I read this several times before I caught this. Elijah laid down on the boy. I don't know why. He either God instructed him to do that, or that was his choice to do that, or he was transferring his life to the boy. I don't know what his thinking was in doing that. Interestingly enough, his protege, God's next prophet, Elisha, does the same thing. Brings another person back to life. Oh, by the way, fun fact, this is the first resurrection ever mentioned in the Bible. First time anybody's ever brought back to life, and it's in this passage. But here's what I find interesting is, Elisha did what he thought he needed to do to bring the boy back. Laid down on the boy, and he cried out to God, would you bring this boy back to life? And what does God do? Nothing. God does not restore him. He has to ask 2 times and still nothing, and then a 3rd time, and the 3rd time God brought him back to life. Now, I'm not an expert on colloquialisms, but I can almost guarantee you this is where we get the term 3rd time's a charm. So, because for whatever reason, 3 times, God does what he does. You know, Paul asked God 3 times to restore his eyesight. God's answer was no to him, but it's interesting that Paul did it 3 times, not 2, not 4, but 3, and the matter was settled. And so he's asking God 3 times here before God responds and gives him his life back. Now, I'll say it to say, don't just throw out a prayer 1 time to God and think it's done. If you do that, you may be missing an opportunity and a blessing and a miracle. It's okay to go back to God time and time and time again. How many testimonies I've heard from parents that tell me they have prayed for their child for decades and decades, and then God moves in their life. After hundreds or even thousands of prayers, God decides to answer. Sunday, someone came forward. We had 4 people get saved in our service, by the way. The first one was a grown man, came forward. I did not recognize him. And immediately he said to me, it's time. I want to give my life to Christ. I did not know at the time he was the family member of one of our families here in the church, and that he was an atheist. And for the last decade, his family had been praying for him and praying for him and praying for him and praying for him. And to their shock, he just, in the service, got up and came down and came to Christ. Don't ever give up praying to God. Sometimes it takes 1, sometimes 3, sometimes more. You just keep praying. All right, so verse 24, then the woman said to Elijah, now I know that you're a man of God and that the word of the Lord from your mouth is the truth. Now that's chapter 17. Any comments about chapter 17 before we move to chapter 18? Yes, Kathy. Fear not. Fear not, yeah. 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 Now, if you're one hot roll away from death, I can kind of understand the fear. And so she doesn't say she's afraid in this passage, but she does say what's going to happen. We're going to go back, have this one little piece of bread, and then we're going to die. So he knows as a mother she's afraid, and he does say that. He starts with that. Don't be afraid.
I don't know if it's coincidental, but it is interesting that it was 3 times. Jesus rose on the 3rd day.
Yeah, that's right. A lot of threes. That's right. Okay, so this culminates now in this chapter. This is a great chapter. 1 Kings chapter 18 is one of the best chapters in the Bible. I don't always say that, but this is a really good chapter because we see God really just come down and let him have it here, and changes really the direction of the nation. 1 Kings 18, verse 1. After a long time, in the 3rd year, the word of the Lord came to Elijah. Go and present yourself to Ahab, and I will send rain on the land. So Elijah went to present himself to Ahab. Now the famine was severe in Samaria, and Ahab had summoned Obadiah, who was in charge of his palace. Obadiah was a devout believer in the Lord. Now I'll stop there just for a second. So Elijah has been waiting now. He doesn't take matters into his own hand. He's waiting for God's directive, and God comes to him and says, it's been long enough. The drought has lasted long enough. God's plan for which he's using the drought is now complete, and it's time to end the drought. So go to Ahab, who has been desperately looking for Elijah for 3 years now. That's why he's been hiding all this time. So he's been looking for him. He says, you just go ahead and go to him, but tell him that the drought's coming to an end. It says the famine was severe, by the way, in Samaria. And so Ahab, who's the king, summoned Obadiah. Obadiah was in charge of the king's palace, and so he's one of the high officials. The interesting thing about Obadiah was, whether Ahab knew it or not, and he probably didn't know it, Obadiah loved the Lord. He was a faithful follower of God. In fact, he even hid, I think it was 100 prophets in a cave, and he'll get to that in just a minute, because he was so faithful. So Ahab summoned Obadiah, and Obadiah was a devout believer in the Lord. Verse 4, while Jezebel was killing off the Lord's prophets, Obadiah had taken 100 prophets and hid them in 2 caves, 50 in each, and had supplied them with food and water. Ahab, so there's 100 prophets left of God's prophets being hidden right now and protected. Ahab had said to Obadiah, go through the land to all the springs and valleys. Maybe we can find some grass to keep the horses and mules alive so that we will not have to kill any of our animals. So they divided the land they were to cover. Ahab was going in one direction and Obadiah in another. So they're looking for grass to keep the animals alive so they don't have to eat them. As Obadiah was walking along, Elijah met him. Obadiah recognized him, bowed down to the ground and said, is it really you, my lord Elijah? Yes, he replied. Go tell your master, Elijah is here. Well, it sounds good so far, right? What have I done wrong, asked Obadiah, that you're handing your servant over to Ahab to be put to death? As surely as the Lord your God lives, there's not a nation or kingdom where my master has not sent someone to look for you. And whenever a nation or kingdom claimed that you were not there, he made them swear they could not find you. But now you tell me, go to my master and say, Elijah's here. I don't know where the Spirit of the Lord may carry you when I leave you. If I go and tell Ahab and he doesn't find you, he will kill me. Yet I, your servant, have worshiped the Lord since my youth. Haven't you heard, my Lord, what I did while Jezebel was killing the prophets of the Lord? I hid 100 of the Lord's prophets in 2 caves, 50 in each, and supplied them with food and water. And now you tell me to go to my master and say, Elijah is here. He will kill me. So you see, Obadiah is scared to death because he knows how ruthless Ahab is. And I think, what does Obadiah really want to happen at this point? I'm guessing that he probably wants Elijah just to go to Ahab himself and say, hey, here I am. Whatever reason, Elijah chooses not to do that. He wants Obadiah to go and tell him. And so Elijah has to assure him or give some assurance. Elijah said in verse 15, as the Lord Almighty lives, whom I serve, I will surely present myself to Ahab today. So Obama, Obadiah went to meet Ahab and told him, and Ahab went to meet Elijah. I would love to have been a fly on a tree watching this scene. Well, Ahab went to Elijah. When he saw Elijah, he said to him, "Is that you, you troubler of Israel?" What does he mean by that? This is all your fault. That's what he means. And he knows it's from God, which is interesting too. This judgment, this famine is the result of God. Verse 18, "I have not made trouble for Israel," Elijah replied, "but you and your father's family have. You have abandoned the Lord's commands and have followed the Baals. Now summon the people from all over Israel to meet me on Mount Carmel, and bring the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah who eat at Jezebel's table." So 450 and 400 is 850. So Ahab sent word throughout all Israel and assembled the prophets on Mount Carmel. It's interesting that Ahab complies. Now, Elijah is making a challenge to him, and so they're about to have a showdown. And so I think Ahab's all over that, and so he does comply. In view of Elijah's directive that Ahab summon the people from all over Israel, it's likely that hundreds, if not thousands, congregated on Mount Carmel. The Carmel range of mountains are 1,742 feet in elevation at its highest point, and it extends about 30 miles to the southeast of modern-day Haifa, which is on the shore of the Mediterranean Sea. So it's about 30 miles from the ocean, from the Mediterranean. It's a beautiful series of rounded peaks and valleys from which the sea can easily be seen. Now, forgive me, I'm going to brag here a second. I'm going to be on Mount Carmel Monday. So will Ann and several of you here, the Bertrams and who else is in here. And so I get to tell this story again Monday on Mount Carmel. Now, if that makes you jealous, in 2 years we're going to go back, okay? I would love, if I could take every member of the church to Israel, I would do that gladly. All right, verse 21. Elijah, is this where I'm supposed to be? 20. 21? Okay. Elijah went before the people and said, "How long will you waver between two opinions?" He's saying this to the Israelites. "If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal is God, follow him." But the people said nothing. Then Elijah said to them, "I am the only one of the Lord's prophets left." Now, that's not entirely accurate, but it is true as far as disclosure, as far as they know, as far as Ahab knows, he's the only one left. And he's definitely the only one left there on Mount Carmel. It's him against whoever, all of these other prophets, 850. I'm the only one of the Lord's prophet left, but Baal has 450 prophets. Get the two bulls. That's not counting the other prophets for the Asherah poles. Get two bulls for us. Let them choose one for themselves and let them cut it into pieces and put it on the wood and not set fire to it. I'll prepare the other bull, put it on the wood, but not set fire to it. Then you call on the name of your God. I'll call on the name of the Lord. The God who answers by fire, he's God. I love that. Then all the people said, "What you say is good." Why do they think it's good, by the way? Because nowhere in this plan do they all die. So I think they're going to get a show either way. And so they said, "Oh, good idea." So Elijah really is pointing out in this contest that the odds, logically, would be 450 prophets to 1. A humanly impossible situation in which to win. Elijah knew there were other prophets of God besides himself, but as far as this contest was concerned, he was the only one of God's prophets left. Verse 25, Elijah said to the prophets of Baal, choose one of the bulls and prepare it first. Notice he gives them their choice. Since there are so many of you, call on the name of your God, but do not light the fire. So they took the bull given to them and prepared it. Then they called on the name of Baal from morning till noon. Oh, Baal, answer us, they shouted. But there was no response. No one answered, and they danced around the altar they had made. At noon, Elijah began to taunt them. Shout louder, he said. Surely he's a god. Perhaps he's deep in thought, or busy, or traveling. Maybe he's sleeping and must be awakened. So they shouted louder and slashed themselves with swords and spears, as was their custom, until their blood flowed. Midday passed, and they continued their frantic prophesying until the time for the evening sacrifice. But there was no response. No one answered. No one paid attention. Then Elijah said to all the people, come here to me. They came to him, and he repaired the altar of the Lord, which was in ruins, because it hadn't been used in so long. Elijah took 12 stones, one for each of the tribes descended from Jacob, to whom the word of the Lord had come, saying, your name shall be Israel. With the stones, he built an altar in the name of the Lord, and he dug a trench around it large enough to hold 2 seahs of seed. He arranged the wood, cut the bull into pieces, and laid it on the wood. Then he said to them, fill 4 large jars with water and pour it on the offering and on the wood. Do it again, he said, and they did it again. Do it a 3rd time. There's your 3 times. He ordered, and they did it the 3rd time. The water ran down around the altar and even filled the trench. At the time of the sacrifice, the prophet Elijah stepped forward and prayed, O Lord, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known today that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant and have done all these things at your command. Answer me, O Lord, answer me, so these people will know that you, O Lord, are God, and that you are turning their hearts back again. Interesting that he includes that in his prayer. Verse 38, then the fire of the Lord fell, burned up the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, and the soil, and also licked up the water in the trench. Then all the people saw this. They fell prostrate and cried, the Lord, he is God. The Lord, he is God. The Lord, he is God. So Elijah steps forward and he prayed without any of the theatrics that his adversaries had. He didn't cut himself. He didn't dance a jig. And by the way, on Sunday morning in our worship, or whenever you worship God in corporate worship, we're not robots, and I always say that. So sometimes our emotions are involved in worship, and I think that's a good thing, particularly joy. Conviction should be evident when we worship God. Ever hop around in worship in order to get God's attention? Don't feel you need to raise your hands. If you want to raise your hand to worship, that's fine. We have a number of people who do that, but don't ever raise your hands thinking this will get God's attention. Like he doesn't see you there until you're waving your arms. You don't have to do that. We don't have to put on a show for God. God already knows you. He loves you. He sees you. He really is concerned about what's going on here. And again, so whatever you do in worship, it should be in response to God, not trying to get God's attention. And so sometimes we get confused about that. You worship God freely within boundaries. Worship God freely, and I teach that here as your pastor, that within boundaries we should have freedom to worship God. Some people, they don't blink. Some of you sit there or stand there very quietly. You don't move your arms. You don't sway back and forth. You don't raise your hands. You don't even sing on the outside, I guess. And some of you are just the opposite. You're going at it. You bring a lot of energy to the room. And I always say, we call this the difference between an introspective worshiper and a demonstrative worshiper. I know those are big words, but they had those kinds of worshipers in the Bible as well. Both kinds were just different people. And that's okay. So if you're standing there quietly and solemnly, and you're not twitching a muscle. Don't stand there and flip out if people are raising their hands and think, oh, those people are crazy. Now, if you're acting crazy, you probably shouldn't do that, Paul would say. On the other hand, if you're a demonstrative worshiper and you see that person in front of you and you think, they're just standing there, they're probably thinking about lunch. No, don't you judge them, because they're not worshiping the same way you are. Only God knows what's going on in our hearts. And so my prayer for both of you is that you're just worshiping from your heart. And some of you will respond in different ways than others physically. Okay? All right. I think I touched a nerve there. So anyway, but in the end, I get the impression that Elijah was more of an introspective worshiper. He knew he didn't have to have all of that motion. He knew he didn't have to dance around and cut himself. I'm so glad that we worship a God that doesn't make us cut ourselves to get his attention. All he had to say was that one little prayer, and fire came out of heaven and just burned it all up. In fact, if you look in verse 40, verse 38, then the fire of the Lord fell and burned up not only the sacrifice and the wood, but it burned up the stones. You have to have a pretty hot fire to burn up stones, and the soil, and also licked up the water in the trench. So the result, all the people fell prostrate and cried, the Lord, he is God, the Lord, he is God. Immediately, verse 40, then Elijah commanded them, seize the prophets of Baal, don't let anyone get away. They seized them, and Elijah had them brought down to the Kishon Valley and slaughtered there. And Elijah said to Ahab, go, eat and drink, for there is the sound of a heavy rain. So Ahab is there at the challenge. I wonder if Elijah couldn't have said to the group, grab Ahab and slaughter him as well, and they would have done it. But Elijah doesn't do that. I assume he's not been commanded to do that, so he doesn't do it. So he says to Ahab, go eat and drink, for there is the sound of a heavy rain. So you go home, eat your meal, because the rain's coming. The drought is over. So, verse 42, Ahab went off to eat and drink, but Elijah climbed to the top of Carmel, bent down to the ground, and put his face between his knees. Go and look toward the sea, he told his servant, and he went up and looked. That's the first time. There's nothing there, he said. 7 times Elijah said, go back. The 7th time the servant reported, a cloud as small as a man's hand is rising from the sea. I think around here, that cloud, the weather guys would go 100% chance of rain. Sorry, but cloud is the size of a man's hand. So Elijah said, go and tell Ahab, hitch up your chariot and go down before the rain stops you. That is, the rain is imminent. It's coming now. Meanwhile, the sky grew black with clouds. The wind rose. A heavy rain came on, and Ahab rode off to Jezreel. The power of the Lord came upon Elijah, and tucking his cloak into his belt, he ran ahead of Ahab all the way to Jezreel. We remember this story for one miracle, but there were actually 3. The first miracle was God brought fire from heaven and consumed the altar and the sacrifice and the water and the stones. But the second miracle was God brought rain. He ended the drought supernaturally. The third miracle, which is really my favorite, is this old prophet Elijah tucked his, he's got what we call a bathrobe, and he took his cloak and he tucked it all in, and he took off running like a teenager. And it says, the power of the Lord came upon Elijah, and tucking his cloak into his belt, he ran ahead of Ahab all the way to Jezreel. Now, how is Ahab getting to Jezreel? He's in a chariot being pulled by horses, and so the power of God comes on Elijah, and he outruns the horses all the way to Jezreel. So I find that to be a wonderful. By the way, do you know how long that was? How far that was? It's about 25 miles. So he ran a marathon. That's divinely given energy. So if you need divinely given energy, if God decides you need it, He'll give it to you. And I sure would like to have that tonight. I'd run all the way home. Most of us don't openly invent gods the way they did in Canaan. We don't call them gods, and we don't formally worship them like the prophets of Baal. But we are tempted to make things in this world and place them above our allegiance to God. The foundation of our faith is the lordship of Christ. When we say He's our Lord, that means above all else. Everything. Above every person, above every object, above every plan, above every habit, above every hobby or interest, God comes first. Above our money and finances, God comes first. Sometimes God allows droughts in our life to bring us to Mount Carmel. What a day that was. Fire from heaven the first half of the day, and for the first time in 3 years, they see rain clouds above their head. Don't you know when those drops hit their face, what a celebration they had, because that meant life. I think our country needs a Mount Carmel experience. Amen? All right, that concludes our Bible study time. Let's look at our prayer list for the week, and we'll pray before we're dismissed. Now, to be